In the world of wristwatches, the chronograph must be the most esteemed complication. Not because it's necessarily the most technically brilliant or the most beautiful from a design standpoint, but because it's found at every level of watchmaking. What we're looking at here are two affordable quartz chronographs with interesting chronograph complications. They're complications which are not merely the standard chronograph movement, and for a quartz watch, they're beautifully designed and also interestingly functional with the spiced up chronographs that you found in each manufacturer. On the right, you've got the SNDA65, the Seiko, and on the left, you've got the T2N700 AB, the Timex. I'm going to refer to the Seiko as the pilot's chronograph just for simplicity, and I'm going to refer to the Timex as the Flyback chronograph. In this review, I'm going to talk about style influences, their specs, take a close look at how the watches are put together, put the watches on the wrist and see how they look, and talk just about, at this price point, what's the better watch. Okay, so both of these watches are obviously military and styled as far as their influences go. Vaguely, they're World War II era designs, designs taken from maybe the gauges of airplanes. More specifically, the Seiko clearly has a design influence from Sing Chronographs, which is a German watchmaker and known specifically for their military style chronographs. And the Timex clearly has influence from Bell and Ross from their vintage series of watches. So both of these watches have a derivative style, and that's a good thing because the chronograph is easy to mess up. It's a complicated movement as far as the dial composition goes in particular, and so if you experiment too much, they can be hard to read and they can be complicated. That being said, the Seiko is clearly the more classic layout with the two major chronograph subdials at 12 and 6, and at 9 you've just got the seconds, which is clicking away. The Timex is taking its chronograph influence from their TX line, which was Timex's sort of upscale line, which has been discontinued and has been sort of resurrected in their Intelligence Quartz line, which is basically an attempt for Timex to move a little bit upscale with their chronographs and also maybe spend a little bit more time trying to make a more interesting complication. Okay, so let's take a look at the Seiko first as far as specs go. The Seiko has a movement in it called the 1792 Quartz. And what's distinctive about this movement in particular, you can see, is it has a 1/20th second chronograph at 12 o'clock. The hour and minutes are in the 6 o'clock subdial. You've just got the so-called sweeping seconds at 9. You've got a date complication at 4. The dial is a matte black dial, and the crystal is a Hardlex crystal, which is a Seiko specific crystal made out of a special hardened plastic. It's a flat crystal. I think it's very pretty. I think it sort of resembles a sapphire crystal in appearance. The pushers here are very standard pushers. They're not threaded in any way. The crown just pulls right out. In order to operate this chronograph, you start and stop it here at the 2 o'clock pusher, and then you just reset it at 4. And as you can see, there's a kind of a theater in the resetting. Basically, at the 6 o'clock subdial, the hour and minutes cycle all the way through before they go back to their starting point. You're looking at a lug width of 22 inches. The dimensions on this watch are 43.5 millimeters, and it's water resistant to 100 meters theoretically, although you wouldn't even want to go swimming with these watches. In my opinion, you could engage a chronograph accidentally. On the back side, you've got a screw down case back that's just in steel. Very simple and unadorned. It's threaded on. The case itself is finished in black ion, which is basically a cheap way of achieving the sort of PVD look that you find in more higher level military chronographs, in IWCs or in SINs or Bell and Ross. In this case, the black ion finish on the Seiko is all a polished black ion finish, and so it's actually fairly shiny, even though the black makes the watch appear a little bit smaller than it is. It's a relatively large watch at the 43.5 millimeters. Now the Timex is very similar in dimensions. You're looking at a 43 millimeter case width. You've got a case height of 12 millimeters. So it's a little bit thicker than the Seiko. The lugs are only 20 millimeters wide, so the strap is actually narrower. The glass on it, the crystal is just a mineral crystal. I don't think it's quite as pretty. It is just a flat mineral crystal. You've got the date between 2 and 3 o'clock. The complication for the chronograph in this watch is fairly interesting. So first of all, it's a flyback chronograph, and that means that you can reset the watch just with one push of a button. So you can set it just by pushing this and then resetting it here, or you can just push this button and it starts right over from there and starts over. So that's kind of the advantage of the flyback, is you can just hit that one button and it'll start over. The flyback chronograph is desirable because it enables you to operate the chronograph over and over again in real time. So if you're timing multiple things, that flyback function is pretty useful. And that's one area that, as far as chronograph functionality goes, the Timex is superior to the Seiko, because the Seiko has to reset that 6 o'clock subdial every time you want to start a new chronograph function. And while the theater at 6 o'clock with the minute and hour hand cycling all the way around is fun, it's not the most functional. So here you just stop it and it resets right back. Now what's interesting about the Timex is that, as you can see, it's got a tachometer chapter ring on here, and the subdial between 9 and 12 is both a 24-hour subdial as well as a chronograph subdial. So you actually have a second time zone on this complication. And so this watch would be great for traveling if you need to keep track of a second time zone. The subdial works as a chronograph when you engage the chronograph, but then once you stop the chronograph, it resets, as you can see, to a second time zone time. One interesting feature, if you will, on this watch is when you pull the crown out, it beeps, and also resets so that you can set specific times for things. So you can get a fairly precise setting on here. You also have the so-called indigo, which is basically a way to achieve lighting the dial in darkness without lume. You've got a more traditional lume in the Seiko, which in the chapter ring is lumed with Seiko's famous lune, and then it's on the hands, but the actual dial and subdials are not loomed at all. So seeing the chronograph at night is not something you would really be able to do, where you would be able to do that with the Timex. One thing you probably notice about the Timex is that the black finish on it is both matte and polished. The watch is also black ion plated, but around the dial it's actually finished in matte, and then on the sides it's polished. One thing I like about this chronograph too is that it has a fairly meaty crown here. I'm going to try to get it to focus for you. Yeah, see, there you go. It's got kind of a toothy 2 layers to it. How do the chronographs feel? I would say that the Seiko has a much more positive feel when you're operating the chronograph. There's a real click when you start, so that you know that you've engaged a chronograph, and when you stop it, it's the same way, and it's true with both buttons. The Timex is really pretty mushy. You can't tell that you've engaged a chronograph except by the fact that you see that the chronograph function is working. And that in and of itself is fairly messy, because as you can see, you've got your hour and second hand. You've got your sweeping seconds, which is just clicking around all the time. That's the ring or the hand with the T on it for Timex. And then the chronograph hand is a pointed arrow hand that starts specifically when the chronograph is going. Now the Seiko, definitely more readable and more traditional design. You've just got your hour and minute hands as your major hands, and then your sweeping seconds, which again it isn't sweeping because it's quartz, but there are your seconds at 9, and then the 2 chronograph functions at top and bottom. So I would say that the Timex's chronograph movement is maybe a little bit more elaborate and functional, whereas the Seiko's movement is more readable, and also maybe prettier with that fancy reset at 6 o'clock. As far as the level of finishing, each case is pretty introductory. It's not very sophisticated. I don't really like ion plating because I find that it can scratch and chip in a way that a PVD or ceramic coating, which is what manufacturers use at higher level watches to achieve black cases, they're not as easily damaged as ion plating. Eventually these watches, after decades of use, that ion plating would not be as good looking as it is now. But for an introductory watch, you are getting a pretty stylish look, one that's definitely been brought in vogue by the likes of Bell and Ross. And so that's nice to be able to find a chronograph that is sort of a want this, buy that situation. You can get an affordable and attractive chronograph at the same chance. On the wrist, the case size is pretty manageable. I'm going to just put on the Seiko real quick. I've got 7-inch wrists here, and it just fills the wrist pretty well without being massive. The big chapter ring makes the dial seem quite a bit smaller, and it is. Resetting it on the wrist is just fine. Neither of the pushers are particularly large or engaging compared to, like, say, a Breitling. They're just not as fun to operate, but they are accessible and easy to use. There's nothing to complain about. One thing I have to mention just straight away is both of the straps on these watches are total rubbish. They're just not attractive and not very good. The Seiko's NATO strap is too thin and kind of cuts into the side of your wrist, and this Timex strap, well, it's a Timex strap, it is not impressive at all. Sorry. So here's the Timex on the wrist. Wears bigger for sure because the tachometer chapter ring is smaller, and so you've got a lot more dial. But from a comfort standpoint, it feels pretty much the same. So, are we going to go with the kind of benchmark Seiko in this case, or the new and fresh take on the chronograph in the Timex? Well, what do you think? I'm interested in hearing what you have to say. I guess my thoughts are, at this price range, which is under $200, I would say, it's just hard to say. If I was just looking for an attractive watch, I would go for the Seiko. If I actually needed a chronograph that I wanted to be using a lot, I would probably go with the Timex. I think that the Timex has a little bit more vibe of a fashion watch, where the Seiko seems like more of a dedicated design more directly taken from military influences. I think I like the design of the Seiko more, even though I think the Timex arrangement with the dial is pretty interesting. I like the bilaterally symmetrical sub-dials and the interesting 24-hour complication built into the chronograph. I think that I guess they're both winners. I would choose the Timex if I wanted a chronograph, and I would choose the Seiko if I just wanted kind of an everyday wearing traditional chronograph. One thing I might want to mention too is that there are other chronographs pretty close to this price range. Seiko has their Irony chronograph, or sorry, not Seiko. Swatch has their Irony chronograph, which is more of a racing style chronograph that is actually a mechanical movement, and that's probably the cheapest you could get into a mechanical movement, or under $200. And then if you're willing to spend $400 or $500, you can easily, find other watches, Tissot's and Hamilton's, and of course you work your way up the ladder, and you can get chronographs from all the other major Swiss manufacturers, and find similar styles. So if this might be a great way to try out the chronograph complication, see if you like it, see if it's something that you'd really be interested in, and then maybe move up from there. They're definitely handsome watches. The chronographs seem to work pretty well. I would say the Seiko feels like it's a better made watch. One thing about the Timex is the Timex's chronograph is that it is noisy. It makes kind of this clicky sound. I don't know if you can hear that, but it is fairly noisy, and the Seiko is completely silent. Like I mentioned, the pushers on the Seiko are superior. I think the Timex's design is fresher and less derivative, even though it's obviously taking a colorway from Bell & Ross, as I mentioned. So anyway, two affordable chronographs with interesting forms of the chronograph complication, and both made by well-regarded watchmakers at the affordable price point. Thanks a lot for watching.